$4.6 billion, a staggering amount of money. That's what a new report from Canada's Auditor General shows the Trudeau government lost through its COVID-19 financial aid programs. The primary reason, because they failed to obtain front-end verification in favor of getting the money out quickly to those in need. The report finding that amount, $4.6 billion, was overpaid to ineligible people who did not qualify to get those benefits. The Auditor General also finds that another $27.4 billion in payments should be investigated, $15.5 billion of which was distributed to the wage subsidy program. Did those people actually qualify or not? Were they eligible? Further investigation needed. The Auditor General says she's advised the Trudeau government that they should go after that money, or at the very least, come clean about what they intend to do over all of this money now. Listen to this.
I would point to existing legislation that requires that every Canadian taxpayer be treated fairly, and that if an individual or a business receives something they're not entitled to, it should be returned. So our expectation is that anyone who has a high indicator of potentially being ineligible should be investigated further. The decision then about recovery is one that I encourage the government to be transparent about what they decide to do. If they want to perhaps forgive payments or take a compassionate approach, then they should just be clear and transparent with all Canadians what to expect.
All right, let's bring in our senior political correspondent in Ottawa, Mike Couture, who's standing by. Mike, a staggering amount of money. Some people are going to call this a total fiasco. Walk us through some of the key findings here and whether, in light of how this all played out, it's that much of a surprise.
Yeah, and certainly the Conservatives have already come out and said that, look, this is money that the Canadian government shouldn't have spent, and they actually blame this now on some of the inflationary crisis that we're seeing in this country right now. But I think everybody needs to take a step back and take a step back in time, Todd, for a moment. Back to 2020, when we were fighting this unknown virus for an unknown amount of time. And all we knew at the time was that there were lockdowns across provinces, right across the country, and a number of workers that had to be forced to stop working. So $4.6 billion in overpayments to people. Not to say that that's not a lot of money, but if you do the math, that's 2% of the total money that was spent. Total money was about $211 billion for COVID aid. That's the CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and the Wage Subsidy Plan. The Wage Subsidy Plan, which, by the way, did get taken by a number of organizations. One of the organizations, if we think back, yes, the Liberal Party, yes, the Conservative Party of Canada. So can they really complain too much about how much money went out the door? That's a question that I think maybe the Conservatives need to answer as well. And I think that's part of the report here that we saw from Karen Hogan, the Auditor General. This was an unprecedented time, unprecedented uncertainty, and certainly you could not fault the government for getting such a program up and running so quickly. The people that needed it desperately needed it, and they got it. Obviously, the money that is still outstanding needs to be gone after, and that is something that Carla Qualtrough, one of the members of Cabinet, said today in response. Have a listen.
We're very interested in the fairness aspect that the Auditor General identified, but the work isn't done, right? We paused repayment during Omicron. We paused repayment when the Canada Workers' Benefit came out. We're trying to work with Canadians in a very difficult time, and I wouldn't mistake a lack of aggressive pursuit for not doing it. It's just we're being compassionate.
And Karen Hogan, the Auditor General, did also note that the federal aid did assist Canada help rebound from the global crisis a little quickly. So I think on that side of it, Todd, she's trying to really sort of give people all of that broad context and how, yes, there's a lot of money outstanding. And I think to the point that Hogan made in that comment that we played in that clip, the government just needs to be clear now. Are you going to go after this money or not? And I think that is something that Canadians deserve as well.
Yeah, and you can kind of tell in the way the minister's speaking, Mike, that there's a sense of, well, we're going to give people the benefit of the doubt. I can only imagine that it's going to trigger a lot of anger on the part of some people, Mike, who are going to see this as people who cheated the system amid all the COVID chaos. And now they have to be held to account and get that money back for Canadian taxpayers.
Yeah, and that was one of the issues at the time, Todd. We remember at the time when they were rolling out these systems, the questions were being asked of the government. How are you going to make sure that the right people are getting this money? Let's also not forget that the NDP at one point in time had said just give everybody the CERB checks. And then at the end of the day, the people from the Canada Revenue Agency will do the math, and then we'll see who deserved it, who didn't. Well, now we're seeing on the back end of this, Todd, that is not so easy. And clearly going after these people is going to be an issue. But again, something that I think the government knew at the time, and not to say that they were willing to take that risk. But I think, again, if you look back and we do the math, 2% of overpayment in total, that's not terrible when you consider how much money has been spent by this government and how much government waste there really is out there, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see what this investigation will turn up. Thanks, Mike, for this. Appreciate it.